Now we're going to make the eye. So first I'm going to take the model I made before, which is really pretty simple, and just do a couple little edits to it. These will just make sure that when it renders it gets a little bit better result. Just kind of opening up the pupil a little bit. I'm going to set the face IDs to be something different as well. We're going to make a new material for this thing too. So the outer shell will be 1, the inner shell will be 2. Now the reason for having the 2 shells is basically that the one part is kind of just a reflective and very shiny area with a little bit of a bump to kind of add, just to pick up the specular highlights, and it really gives a little bit of spark of life to your character. You can do a lot with this. We're going to put a little HDRI on it, reflection, and just a little bit of a tiny little bit of noise on it, just for the bump. And that'll just kind of give him a little bit more life. And I'm just going to symmetrize this, put a little symmetry on there. Putting a quick, just a planar map. You could do a spherical map on this and paint quite a detailed map if you wanted to, but your eye doesn't really rotate that far unless you're doing some animation where the guy's eyes are rolling back in his head. He's like a zombie or something. But we're not going to do that, so we're just going to do a quick planar map, and you'll get the idea of how you could detail an eye. You saw pretty much all the different ways we could do UVs from the last from the first chapter. So anything goes. Whatever you feel more comfortable with, just use that. Whatever gets you the best results. Now the first thing we're going to try here is to use a skin shader on the actual base of the eye. Technically, it's a little bit more accurate. I don't ever really do it. It just slows everything down quite a bit. But if you're going to do a very close-up on the eye, you might want to do some of these things. The shellac to add a little bit shininess to it. The skin shader has no reflection, really. There's some settings in there that should work, but they don't seem to give a very predictable result. So what we'll do as a trick, we'll do it on characters' faces and anything really that needs skin and a reflection. We'll put a shellac on there, put the reflection on that, and turn it down so there's basically only reflection showing up. The shellac is basically an interesting material where you can really combine and give a really glossy look to some things. Say a character gets wet, you could use that for that setting without having to worry about tweaking your skin shader at the base. Now, you can use Textporter to export your maps like we did before. And here's another way you can do it too. Since we're just doing a planar map, I'm just going to crop around the border there. I'm going to close some of these. I've got too much stuff open. It's kind of hard to find my files. And one of these, I have an eye. I'm going to use my own eye to make this. And it's not the best reference because, as you can see, my eye is kind of closed. But we're going to paint this eye pretty much using some of the texture from my real eye. As you can see, I really need to get some sleep. I'm pretty bloodshot, but it's going to work for this guy's eye, especially for his bad eye, too. And so it lines up pretty good there. Luckily, this is a spherical shape, so we can kind of cheat a little bit right here. As you can see, we want to make sure we don't have any of this highlight painted in the map. If you're just doing a still, you might want to keep it in there. You'd probably get a little bit more realistic result with less work, but we're doing this for a cinematic character, so he's going to be moving around a lot, and it would look really weird if his reflection was locked onto a part of his eye. And even weirder if it doesn't match up. So first we're just going to kind of paint a little bit of the color of the eye around this, duplicate this so we can kind of, there we go. We're starting to get rid of the reflection already, you can see. And once we have this basically in there, we need to add the pupil. Because it's a photograph, my pupil didn't really come out too good in the photo. So all we have to do is paint it a little bit. And maybe a little bit of a border around the eye itself. You can see the white part of the eye, or the kind of pinkish part of the eye at this point. When you're making textures, you never really want to make anything 100% white, especially because most places and most people, we're going to do different passes when they render stuff. And what happens is all these areas that you paint white, even a white t-shirt, once they add the diffuse and once they add the ambient and once they add the specular and everything, it all just builds up until you have this glowing mass of whiteness. So we usually try to keep the whitish color to a bit of a gray for any kind of color that we're doing. So here I want to even all this out so it doesn't have this different tonal change all around. But I also want to keep some of the weird little details that my eye has. pretty low res, but since we're going to paint over this, we're going to use this kind of as a guideline. And I'm just using the smudge brush here to kind of mimic what my eye naturally does. I've got these kind of brown and blue and green colors in here. And you'll see I'm just kind of pushing stuff around at this point. This isn't going to be something that's hyper real and zooming quite up in the face, but we still want to maybe do a couple close renders of his face, so make sure the eye looks decent. And this is a very quick way to get that kind of result. I want to break this up a little bit more. It's getting a little too, especially since it's a low res thing, it got a little bit of that grainy look to it. So let me fix that up a little. I'm just using that to, already we kind of have an eye feel to it. That didn't line up quite right, so we're just going to replace it a little. Merge it down. I want to get some of this eye meat in there. Some of these veins and whatnot. You could paint all this if you wanted to as well, but there's a pretty quick way to kind of get it all the way around, and since we're not doing any hyper close-up stuff, I think this will work just fine. We're just cloning and erasing and just going to fix this up a little, and then we're going to fade it back a little bit because we just want some texture in there. And then I'll paint in a few We'll add this to the map. Let's take a look at this. What do we have in here? Is that a bitmap? I saved the HDRI map in the wrong place, so normally we'd want all of this to be in the raw directory so that when we copy everything over, we don't have to do a lot of path changes. We have some nice scripts at Blur that'll do it pretty quick, but still, the less of this you have to do, the better. Okay, we can see that even if he looks all the way up, we still got plenty of eye texture there, that he's going to be just fine. I'm going to add it to the bump as well. And then we don't need there doesn't really need to be a shininess to this. Now we have it as a skin shader right now, which technically would be more correct. And we turn the subcolor to kind of a whitish color, and we turn the intensity down quite a bit. And the problem here is that it's going to take a little bit more setup. We're going to have to make sure that overall his eye doesn't glow around the skin of his eye as well. So really, I'm just going to kind of just turn it down to a standard material, and just a normal Brazil Advanced, and then I'm going to turn the reflection area to a standard metal, which gives kind of just the right fall off that we want for that nice sharp kind of highlight. Here it comes. You can see, looks like an eye to me. I think it's going to work just fine for our purposes, and it has just a little spark of life in it, so I think that's great. So once we're done with his eye, I'm still not quite happy with the head anyway, so I think we need to put a little bit more work into it. So one thing I like to do is put a little bit of a fall off on the color map. One being a little bit more saturated, and the other one just being its normal, gives a little bit of more life to the character. First, I kind of look at this character. There's some parts I don't like. Once I have the textures on here, I realize, boy, his nose looks pretty bad. Because I didn't follow Hong's design quite enough. It's just a little wide. It's kind of weird looking. So I'm going to do a quick paint over. I'm looking at Hong's design really quick. This looks a lot better there. So let's line these two up. You can see it's pretty close overall. My camera's not exactly like his was, but I'm just going to force this thing really quick into position so I can see where I want to take this, what I want to add to it. Yeah, that's looking better. So in the last disc, we actually talked a lot about paint overs and how they really help in the modeling process. We'll give these to our concept artists a lot of times to do, but you can do them yourself as well, and they'll really save you a lot of time. Instead of trying to figure it out in the 3D program, it's like sketching it out really quick. Gives you an idea of where you want to go. And then you could use these as image planes, or you can just kind of have an idea in your head. So here we go. I'm going to add another ring in here too, because I want to pull this out. It's getting a little sharp on it underneath. His eye was looking a little strange too, so we're just adjusting that. Now I'm going to toss this into ZBrush. I'm going to go a little fast here. So we're in ZBrush now. Add the face. You can see I didn't have my UV textures on channel 1. So I'm going to leave the, I'm going to use the modifier on top there. I don't need to collapse it before I export. There we go. Now when I import back in ZBrush, I don't have to redo the whole scene. All I have to do is re-import. What's great in ZBrush is that you could do UV edits so long as you don't change the face. Excuse me, so long as you don't change any vert IDs. It won't mess up. It'll just adjust your UVs, and it'll also adjust your proportions. So if you did a character and then you realize, oh my goodness, I did all this detail and there's just the map won't make anything on the nose. Well, you could completely re-UV the character and bring him back in so long as you don't change anything on the vert ID. And sometimes it's nice to do these details when you have the texture on there, because it gives you something to aim for. His mouth looks a little weird. I want to fix that up a little, fix the nose up some better. I also want to break some of the symmetry that we have on this character. It's not quite very real or natural looking. Especially the nose. This guy looks like he's been around in quite a few fights, and his whole face being skewed as it is. Doesn't make sense for the nose to be perfectly straight and nice. So I'm just going to mask this area off so I can move the lip without affecting any else of the mouth. Alright, I'm going to keep looking back at Hong's design, because even though I'm doing a little bit different stuff with the face, because I had it in my mind's eye kind of how I wanted it, I still really liked some of the shapes that he had, and I want to make sure I keep some of that. And then you can use the morph target to kind of switch back and forth and really see what you actually did to the character. Sometimes just little subtle things can really help a lot. Then I like to put a morpher on top of my first mesh, because there was a lot of stuff we had on there. We had a little bit of a push modifier on there, very, very small. We also had the separate UV channels and the turbo smooth, and sure I could add that to the other mesh, but if I can use it as a morph target, I can fade it back and forth, and I can even do it on selections. So I like to do a lot of different ZBrush edits. Maybe I'll just work on the nose and bring that in, and then just use that as a morpher. And then maybe just the ears, and then I can kind of recreate the character just using morph targets. Be interesting to make a nice base mesh and just kind of do this in ZBrush with all these different changes to just one area, and then be able to just dial in on a generic mesh and kind of shape a starting point character. I'm not sure if it would actually be faster than just doing it all in ZBrush. And before I export back, I always hit the cage button, which I believe I've mentioned a few times, but it's important to do that, otherwise you're going to get a very smooth result, and you lose all that detail that we put in there. And when you got a guy like this with these ears and the scar and all this stuff, the more it smooths out, they're just going to look stranger and stranger. So that's the important thing, is if you're just doing stuff for normal maps, to make sure you store a morph target before you generate your maps. And also, if you're doing edits, it's nice to store it too. But it's never too late. You can always store a morph target and then re-import your base mesh and switch between the two just fine. You can see I'm dialing that back in as a separate thing. I want to play with some stuff. I feel like the eyes were a little big and maybe a little far away. The one on the one side is okay because he's got that messed up jaw, but he's got a bit of a muzzle going on, so let's fix that up a little. Like I said before, it's never too late to do these modeling edits, and you can put all the texture you want, but sometimes you realize you need to do some changes. There is a problem though, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you really got to double check. Make sure that your UVs aren't shooting off into world space, because I've had that happen a couple times where I think everything's fine until the very end and I go look at all my UVs that I've done stuff on, and even though I had preserved UVs on, it did anything but. But good 75% of the time it works just fine, and make sure that you kind of slide around where your texture space is. Sometimes you don't want that though, so make sure. You can also turn it on in material so you can actually see what it's doing. But that'll slow down stuff a lot, so be careful.